Hey, great, thanks, Aftay. And then next we'll have a presentation by Cindy Vojtech with some really interesting perspectives on regulatory examination reports. So Cindy, you have 15 minutes, and I'll leave the floor up to you.
Thank you. Is this mic working? We're good? Awesome. I would like to thank the conference organizers for inviting this or accepting this paper into the conference. This is my first time here, and I look forward to participating in future conferences. I am only a bank researcher, so this has been a very fascinating discussion, and I hope you'll enjoy this discussion as well. I am presenting some work by myself and some colleagues at the board, and at this point I have to use the usual disclaimer. These are our opinions, not governors, and not research staff. So what are we doing in this paper? We are looking at the sentiment, or like the tone, that is in examination reports, and we are trying to understand what information is in there, how it relates to ultimately to bank outcomes. We think this is a particularly important question or question to ask because there's really not a lot known about the supervisory process. Prior research has primarily focused on CAMEL scores, and I think a lot of the audience is familiar with that rating system, but I will talk about it in a few slides. And they'll use the rating scores to understand what really the supervisors are doing. We would like to go beyond that, and we're going to do that by looking at the contents of these examination reports, the comprehensive exams that all commercial banks undergo. Our sample is going to focus on state member banks, so these are the banks that are regulated by the Federal Reserve, and we're only going to be looking at the small and medium-sized banks. So we're going to exclude the largest banks. So particularly, we have this audience in mind, the small banks or community banks. And we're going to ultimately study how the sentiment, the tone of the language in these examination reports conveys important information about bank outcomes. Okay, let me show you a little about the sample we're going to be looking at. So the sample begins in 2004, continues until 2016. We do have a slight increase in the sample size because of essentially the type or the format of the report and how we can actually scrape the text from the exams. Again, I think a lot of this audience is familiar with CAMEL's ratings, but this is a rating system used for all commercial banks, and it comprises of several components. There's the overall comprehensive score, and this is the overall safety and soundness of that bank. It is not an additive or weighting process. It is a score of the bank in total. In addition to that score, banks will receive a score for each of the letters. It's an acronym. CAMEL's is an acronym, and so you'll have a capital adequacy score. That's related to the solvency of the bank. You have an asset quality score that's related to the performance of the loan portfolio. We have a management score that's associated with really the risk practices of the management and also whether or not they're following the laws. So you have things like Bank Secrecy Act that you see in that component. We have earnings, which relates to the profitabilities of the bank, liquidity, the liquidity status of that bank, and then finally, sensitivity to market risk. We're going to not look at that section. It's less applicable to the smaller banks. Each score is on a 1 to 5 rating system, 1 being the strongest banks and 5 being the weakest banks. That is particularly important for thresholds. So a rating of 1 or 2 is considered a strong bank. If you get a score of 3, 4, or 5, that would be considered a weak bank, and you'll be subject to more scrutiny. And you have perhaps limitations on what you can do. So this figure is, again, summarizing the sample that we have. You could look across the composite score in the bottom right panel, and then each of the components that we're going to look at. And this is now itemizing or identifying strong banks versus weak banks. And we can see during the financial crisis in particular, many weak banks were identified on their composite score, again on the bottom right. But you also see that was highlighted particularly by the asset quality in the top middle panel and the earnings component in the bottom left panel. Okay, a little more about the sentiment score idea. It's a common practice in the literature, and what we show here is give you a sense of how this works. So what the sentiment score is going to do is going to assign either a positive or negative or neutral score to each word. And this is shown on the left. We're looking at all the words in the earnings section across the sample. And we see positive words in blue, negative words in red. The y-axis is the frequency of that word as it appears in all the documents. And then across the x-axis, you have the average CAMEL score for banks that have that word. And as you can see, the positive words are associated with stronger CAMEL scores, 1 to 2. And the red words are associated with lower or weaker scores, 3, 4, and 5. Again, you have earnings, the earnings section on the left, on the management on the right. So you could get a sense of the types of words that we're associating to establish a sentiment for that section. There's a lot of ways that we could build a sentiment score. This is established in the literature. What's important to think about is the dictionary you use to assign this positive and negative word choice. It's also important to think about the weighting scheme that you use. To identify the best scheme, we're going to do a horse race in the first part of the paper to judge essentially what is the best sentiment method that we want to do. The way that we're going to benchmark or establish the strongest method is we're going to correlate the CAMEL's ratings with the sentiment scores. And ultimately what we find is we're going to use a dictionary, the LM dictionary, that was built using essentially SEC filings. So that probably makes sense. That would make sense, or that's related to the kind of content you're going to see in an examination report. And we're going to use two weighting schemes, the polar weighting scheme and the valence shifter weighting scheme. And then to kind of prove the success of this scheme, this figure is summarizing the polar weighting scheme on the left and the valence weighting scheme on the right. On the panels, we now have the CAMEL score. So the strongest CAMEL score being 1 at the top, all the way to 5 at the bottom. And you can see the sentiment scores, negative to positive, left to right. And we see that as you improve your CAMEL score, going from 5 to 1, you are indeed getting a higher sentiment score. The big difference between the two weighting schemes is you get a narrowing of the distribution. Okay, now to the main test that we want to do in this paper. We're now going to relate sentiment scores to bank outcomes. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at either all the text in the document or a section of the text of the examination report, calculating a sentiment score on that language. We're going to look at the CAMEL score. So we're going to try to strip out what's actually already the information that's in that CAMEL score, and we're going to relate it to a bank outcome 1 year later. Also notice that we're going to use the outcome, that variable that was taken at the time the examination report was done. In regression terminology, we're going to regress an outcome 1 year in the future based off of that outcome when the examination report was written, the CAMEL score when that examination report was written, and the sentiment content in that examination report. Okay, this slide is everyone else trying to avoid regression tables. This slide is summarizing essentially the baseline results of the paper, as well as when we split the sample between weak and strong banks. So if you start at the top of this table, if we look at all the language in the examination report and look at the composite score, the outcome variable that we're going to look at here is our supervisory actions. In particular, we're looking at matters requiring attention and matters requiring immediate attention. And I don't need to tell the banks, the members of the banks here that you don't want to see those, right? So matters requiring attention, not a good thing. You're trying to dodge those. What do we find? If we look at the sentiment in that document, to the extent that there's positive sentiment in the whole document, that is associated with fewer matters requiring attention, matters requiring immediate attention at the next examination report. So there's positive relationship there. The next result I'd like to highlight is on asset quality. If you have positive sentiment in the examination report, 1 year later you will have less delinquencies and fewer net charge-offs. On the management score, we're going to use it to look at the same outcome variable, matters requiring attention. To the extent that there's positive sentiment in the management section of the report, by the time the next examination report happens, there are fewer matters requiring attention. And then again, finally on earnings, you have positive sentiment in the earnings section. it's just correlated with higher ROA and higher pre-provision net revenue by 1 year later. Okay. Now think about splitting the sample between, again, the weak banks, 3, 4, or 5, and the strong banks, a score of 1 or 2. The result I'd really like to highlight here is the capital result. So we didn't find any kind of correlation when we look at all the sample, but when we look particularly at the weak banks and look at the tone, positive tone in this section is related to stronger capital ratios by 1 year later. So it seems this is consistent with the supervisors behaving and focusing on their tone in a particular setting of that of a weak bank. The result of asset quality and earnings still hold on for the weak banks. On the strong banks, what's particularly interesting is that this is where the management score is really correlating. So what is this consistent with? The tone, the language chosen for the management section is particularly for the strong banks. You could think about this setting where they're getting a strong score, but they still have matters requiring attention. So perhaps that requires a little more language to explain what's happening in this setting. And again, if there's more positive sentiment in this management section, that's related to fewer matters requiring attention by the next examination. Okay. So we do some other robustness tests to understand different settings. So for example, given our sample period, we'll divide the Great Financial Crisis into the post period and see, again, if supervisors seem to be changing their, really focusing or adopting different behaviors with this relationship. And we find that the results for asset quality and earnings are particularly driven by that Great Financial Crisis. If we reflect back to the figure I showed before, those were where we saw the biggest difference between weak and strong banks. Those were driving those composite scores. Another cut that we do is we look at examination report and then what happens 2 years later. And many of the results still hold, though not surprisingly, the magnitudes are lower. And then another thing we're wondering is if it seems like there's a different behaviors when we're looking at very small banks, so $250 million and below, and then 250 to 10 billion. Again, we're only looking at community banks. And the results are essentially the same. So it doesn't appear that the supervisors are adopting different practices between the two different groups of banks. Okay. So what did we do in this paper? We, again, are trying to understand what supervisors are doing when they're maintaining this soundness, safety and soundness of the banking industry. What are they doing beyond Camel's scores? Well, we do think they are doing something. I guess I have a biased hat, perhaps, as I'm at the Federal Reserve Board. But we do find that they are conveying important supervisory information when they're conducting these examinations. And in particular, they're on this last bullet, they seem to focus their behaviors a little differently given the environment they're in or given the type of bank that they're looking at, if you think about the weak versus strong banks. So yes, indeed, bank supervisors play a meaningful role in the surveillance of our banking system, keeping it safe and sound. Thank you very much.